The author of Gulliver's Travels invented a name. Not a character name, not a place name, but an actual human name that millions of real people carry today. He made it up for a woman he was obsessed with, and somehow, 3 centuries later, it stuck. That name is Vanessa, and the story behind it is stranger and more human than you probably expect. To understand where Vanessa comes from, you need to picture the early 1700s. London and Dublin are connected by politics, literature, and a whole lot of complicated personal relationships. This is the era of the coffee house, the pamphlet, the satirical poem. Writers are celebrities. Jonathan Swift, the man who would eventually give the world Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal, is already a towering figure in this world. He moves through powerful circles, he corresponds with kings and politicians, and he has a habit of forming intense, complicated bonds with women. Names in this period carry enormous weight. The word name itself comes from Old English, from the Proto-Germanic root nomen, which traces all the way back to the Proto-Indo-European root nomen, meaning simply name. By the 1610s, to have a name meant to have a reputation, to matter. When Swift decided to invent one, he was doing something genuinely unusual. Coinages happen in literature all the time, but a coinage that jumps off the page and into the real world, into baptism records and school registers, that almost never happens. Here is how it actually happened. Around 1708, Jonathan Swift met a young woman named Esther Vanhomrigh. She was the daughter of a Dutch merchant who had settled in Ireland, and she was sharp, educated, and deeply taken with Swift. He was in his early 40s. She was in her late teens. By any modern reading, the dynamic was complicated from the start. Swift became her intellectual mentor, then something more ambiguous. They wrote letters. He visited often, and somewhere in that correspondence and closeness, he began writing a poem for her. The poem was called Cadenus and Vanessa, and it was finished around 1713. In that poem, Swift takes Esther Vanhomrigh's name and transforms it. He fuses the first syllable of her family name, Van, from Vanhomrigh, with Essa, a pet form ending of her first name, Esther. Van plus Essa. Vanessa. It is, by any measure, an act of literary intimacy. He is encoding her into language, giving her a name that belongs only to the two of them, a private signal dressed up as a classical-sounding invention. The poem was not published during Esther's lifetime. She died in 1723, and the poem appeared in print shortly after her death, which means the name began circulating publicly only then. Now, here is where things get interesting from a naming perspective. The name sat in the literary record for over a century. People knew the poem, scholars read it. But Vanessa as a name given to children, that does not show up in any reliable record until 1828. That is the earliest documented use of Vanessa as an actual given name. More than 100 years passed between Swift coining the word and someone deciding it was fit for a real person. Why the delay? Partly because literary names were not automatically adopted as given names in the 18th century. Partly because the poem's backstory, a clergyman and a much younger woman in an undefined romantic entanglement, was not exactly the wholesome origin story parents look for, but names have a way of outlasting their baggage. By the 19th century, enough distance had accumulated that Vanessa simply sounded like a name. Melodic, vaguely classical, feminine without being common, and it began to spread. There's also a butterfly. In 1808, the entomologist Johann Christian Fabricius used the name Vanessa to label a genus of butterflies. Whether he took it directly from Swift's poem or from some independent classical-sounding impulse is not entirely clear, but after that, the name had a second life in natural history. That scientific usage likely kept the word visible and gave it an additional layer of cultural legitimacy. Vanessa was no longer just a private pet name in an old poem, it was also a creature with wings. So here's what most people get wrong. If you look up the name Vanessa, you will often read something like, Jonathan Swift coined Vanessa as a pet name in 1713 from Esther Vanhomrigh. And that part is true. What people then assume, though, is that 1713 is effectively when the name began. That Swift used it, it caught on, and here we are. The reality is messier and more interesting. The name did not catch on in 1713. It sat dormant for well over a century. Swift's invention and the name's actual adoption as a given name are separated by more than 100 years. The coinage and the currency are two completely different events. Swift made the word. He did not launch the name. The people of the 18th century read that poem and did not immediately start naming their daughters after a clergyman's complicated muse. What actually launched Vanessa as a usable name is a slower, quieter process, repeated use in literature, the butterfly genus giving it scientific respectability, and eventually the 19th century's appetite for names that sounded ancient and romantic without actually being either. Vanessa fit that perfectly. It sounds like it could be Roman. It is not. It sounds like it has centuries of history behind it. It has about 100 years of genuine use. Today, Vanessa is simply a name. Most people who carry it have no idea it was manufactured by one specific person in one specific moment of emotional intensity in early 18th century Dublin. It peaked in popularity in the United States in the 1980s, consistently appearing in the top 50 most popular girls' names for a stretch of about 2 decades. It has softened since then, drifted down the rankings, which is itself a very normal name trajectory. The butterfly genus Vanessa still exists in scientific classification. If you have ever watched a painted lady or a red admiral flutter past, you were looking at a member of the genus Vanessa. Swift's coinage, filtered through Fabricius, is now embedded in the taxonomy of the natural world. That is an unusual kind of immortality for a love poem. Vanessa connects to a much older story about how names work at all. The word name itself, as we noted earlier, goes back through Old English nama and Old Saxon namo, through Proto-Germanic noman, all the way to the PIE root nomen. That root is also where we get the Latin nomen, which gives us nominate, nomenclature, nominal, and even noun. To name something is one of the oldest and most fundamental human acts. Every culture has deep linguistic infrastructure built around the concept. What Swift did in 1713 was participate in that ancient act, but in a highly personal, almost reckless way. He named someone who already had a name. He gave her a second identity, a literary self that would survive her. Esther Vanhomrigh died at around 35 years old. Vanessa has now been carried by millions of people across 3 centuries. There's also something worth noting about how invented names become real names. Shakespeare did it too. The name Jessica almost certainly originates in The Merchant of Venice from around 1596. Miranda appears in The Tempest in 1611 and is now a completely normal given name. Wendy is often traced to J.M. Barrie and Peter Pan. Literary invention feeding into everyday identity is a recurring pattern in English-speaking cultures, and it says something about how much authority we grant to writers, even unconsciously. We trust them with language, and sometimes we trust them with something more personal. We trust